Hey, what's going on there guys? Jack here from Integrity, and in this video we'll be converting this picture of this adorable Maltese in a field into this wholesome animation, all from using Photomotion depth. The difficulty within this animation will be to make this 3D scene seem as immersive as possible in regards to that depth. The first stage is to, well, of course, open up this Photomotion X folder, and then of course we're just going to double click on this Photomotion depth folder as well, and finally just double click on the Photomotion depth project itself. Now, unlike other projection systems like Parallax, Horizon or Portrait, we won't be separating this image into layers, so we can just jump straight into depth and import in our picture. What we'll need to do first is just double click on this Start Depth button over here on the viewport, and when we get into the main dashboard, we'll then just double click on this Add Photo button over here in order to get access into this blank composition. Here is the part where we're going to be importing in our picture, so let's just jump to the desktop here and then just drag and drop this image into the After Effects project panel. Now what we'll do is drag and drop it into this composition tab over here, and then of course what we're going to do is just parent it to the parent settings layer whilst holding shift. Now within this example, parenting isn't exactly crucial, but if you brought this dog photo into Photoshop and then added a series of text layers, say for example, and stuff like that, then definitely use the parent layer here. However, since this is one solitary image, there's not really so much of a need. It's just good practice. Okay, so the next step, of course, is just to start adjusting the scaling attributes here on that parented layer. So what we'll do is just bring down the scale so that we can fit the whole image into this composition. Now you might be wondering about the gaps on either side here, and what we're going to be doing later is removing those by changing the aspect ratio manually when we get into the export composition, so don't worry about attempting to get rid of these until we get into the main export composition. So back at the main dashboard, what's next? Well, we're going to need to set up our depth map. In case you're unsure, a depth map is just basically a monochromatic mask that represents how close or further away an object is to that 3D camera. The more white it is, the more movement you'll see, while the more darker, the more static those elements will be. So let's just get into setting one up now within this example. What we'll need to do is just double click on this Add Depth button here, which will bring us into this composition. Here we have three options to play around with. We can either use Smart Depth, Import Depth, or Paint Depth. For this example, we'll be using both Smart Depth and Paint Depth. So to begin, we'll just double click on this Smart Depth button here. Cool, so now we're in the Smart Depth composition, which is basically a quick and easy way to set up depth layers. Now down here we have four different layers. We have close, middle, further, and distant. Each one of these layers represents a measure of distance, and to activate it, we just need to set up a mask on top of it. So first, of course, we'll select the close layer down here, and then go up here to the pen tool, and then just select it. In this example, we'll be masking out the dog's face here, as that's the closest object to the camera when that photo was actually taken. We're not going to worry about the floor, as that's something that we'll sort out later within this composition. So as we mask, you'll see this cyan outline, and what we want to do is to have this cyan mask outline covering the whole of the dog's face here. After we're done, we should end up with something like this. Pretty neat. The next thing to do is just select this middle layer here and then doing something similar. This time we're just going to create a selection of the dog's body, as that's the second element that's furthest away from the camera. If there were any other objects, we'd use other layers here, but for this example we're only going to be sticking with the close and middle layers here. We'll also just conclude this mask behind the dog too, just to ensure that we don't end up with any areas which don't contain depth. And when we're done, we should end up with something similar to the first mask that we created, but in a more saturated blue color. So that's our masks finished within this composition. Let's just swap out from the pen tool to the selection tool up here, as we now need to be adding in the floor. To begin, we'll click on this bottom button over here to the bottom right of the viewport, and then navigate over to Effect Controls. If you don't see Effect Controls, by the way, just navigate over to Window here, and then ensure that this Effect Controls tab has a blue tick next to it. If not, just click on it and it should appear to the top left over here next to your project panel. Okay, so the first step is to click on this Activate checkbox here, which will turn that floor panel on within our Smart Depth composition. We'll next just click on this corner pin and then navigate over to the main dashboard here. This is the bottom floor plate, which will basically act as a shortcut in terms of adding in that depth data of the daisies here. We also have these panels available for the top and sides too, just in case you want to try these out with a different example. Right, so within this example, we're going to be lining us up within our image to the edge of the daisy field in this example. If you don't see the corners, just make sure that in Effect Controls, you have this corner pin tab selected. Right, so we'll just move this corner up here by clicking and dragging it to the left out of the viewport, so it's just where the edge is here. Then we'll do the same with this pin to the right here, just drag it off screen and then line it up roughly to the edge of the field. Not too bad. We'll next just need to adjust the left point slightly so we end up with this straight line across the screen. With that done, let's just jump into that Edit Depth composition, the one that we accessed just before this one. Okay, right, so as you can see, we have this monochromatic representation of this dog here in the field. We can see that the ground here is going off into the distance, and we have this face which is a grey-white, and we have the body which is a slightly more darker colour. What this basically means is that we'll see more movement on the face here than we will at the back of the body, and it looks promising so far, although it's not exactly perfect. So the face here exists all in the same depth, if that makes sense. It's all the same colour more or less. So when you get to animating this as it is now, it's not really going to look very dynamic and the animation will look fairly flat. So for this example, in our image, the nose and tongue should be a little bit brighter in contrast to the ears, as those are closest to the camera when that photo was taken. We'll want that reflected within our depth map, otherwise again, the animation won't exactly look lifelike and will instead look fairly flat. Right. So what we'll want to do is just select this close button first, as that controls the close layer that we just made within that other composition, basically the mask that we created around the dog's head. Then what we'll do is just go over to Effect Controls and select this checkbox under Enable Gradient, which will enable the gradient for the face here. Now Photoshop users might feel right at home for this, but just try and bear with as much as possible. A gradient of data is basically just a ramp of one color to another, and in this example we have from white to black. Now we have this gradient data on the head, however our start color is set to black while our end color is set to white. So what we'll do is we'll just hit this swap colors here, which will make things that much clearer in terms of our start and end colors. Next, what we'll do is just change this ramp shape, and we'll switch it from linear to radial, which means that the gradient will radiate out from each point in a circular fashion instead of basically just ramping from top to bottom or from left to right. And of course the next thing to do is just select this target icon next to Start a Ramp, and then just in the viewport plonk it directly on the nose over here, as again that's the closest point of that image to the camera, and therefore that's where the most amount of movement should come from. Next, what we'll do is move the end of ramp, this black here. Now we don't need to use the target function here. Actually, once the start is allocated, often it's just easier to find the endpoint on the screen, basically the small little icon here, and just move it roughly to where we think it should be. You can see that the closer these 2 points are, the more harsher that gradient becomes, and therefore we're picking a lot more darker shades of black and grey along the ears and to the top of the head, which is pretty much what we want. So we'll just eyeball this point roughly, and when we have a result where the nose and the front of the face is more light than the ears and top of the head, we know that we're in the right place in terms of this depth gradient. Cool, so the next step is just to adjust the body, as now it's kind of merged in with the depth of the face here too, and we want them both to be in their own visually distinct different depth layers. So let's just click on this middle button here and then navigate over to Effect Controls, where there is this option called Layer Brightness, which we'll want to dial down ever so slightly. Somewhere near 31 will do. Cool, so if we go back to the main viewport, we can see that the legs and the rest of the body are a little bit more visually distinct in terms of their depth in contrast to the face. Let's also adjust the ground too, just to get a better perception of the situation. Okay, so what we'll want to do is just click on this settings here and then go to auto displacement walls and then ramp this up a tad. What that will do is just change the displacement between the bottom floor plate and the image, so that now we have some of the image poking through in this displacement map settings. Okay, so well, as a result, we can notice where the legs are situated in terms of the ground, and it isn't exactly right. The legs here should be nearer to the shade of grey to the ground where they're situated on, just over here. So much like before, let's just select the middle button here and then what we did earlier, go back to Effect Controls and then bring this layer brightness a little bit further down in order just to have the feet and the ground's tone match a little bit more so. And with that done, we're ready to move on to the final stage of setting up our depth map, and that is of course painting. To begin, we'll just select this paint depth here, and then with our playhead at the beginning of our composition, just go up here to the brush tool and then double click on the viewport to start the process. Before doing anything, we'll just want to adjust the brush here slightly within this paint window just over here. First off, we'll want to ensure that the brush foreground swatch is set to white, and then bring down the flow here to around 5%, so we're roughly only applying a soft light touch really. Next, we'll just adjust the diameter here to something a little bit more larger. Right, so the first step to this is just applying a lot of white to the bottom area of the screen here, where a lot of these daisies are. That's because, of course, those are the closest to the camera even before the dog. So if you check out the original image, you can see this rather quite clearly. Okay, so the next step is just adding in those smaller details. So we'll need to go over to Effect Controls and then bring up the Paint Image Layer Opacity first, as we'll need to see the flowers of the daisies in order to paint over them. And of course, the next thing that we'll do is just jump back to the brush settings over here and bring down the diameter dramatically to a very small brush. What we want to do is just paint in these daisies here just to make them pop within the animation, and we'll try and do this in accordance to how far away they are. So for these daisies that are closest to us, we'll apply quite a lot of white here, while those ones that are further back, we'll apply a slightly more softer touch and try not to apply as much. This might take a while, so we'll just skip ahead when it's finished. And now you can see that we have all of these white dots on screen where all of these daisies have been painted in. Next, once we're happy, let's just go over to Effect Controls here and bring down this image layer opacity a very small amount, and let's see here if there are any last details that we missed. Well, there's of course the dog's tongue, so let's just paint that in with a solid white, so we'll see a lot of movement on that tongue. Pretty good and almost there, although let's just bring down the image layer opacity even further, then go back to the paint panel over here and then bring the diameter up, and what we'll want to do now is just add a small amount more to the dog's nose and chops here, just generally bringing out those areas of the dog's facial structure, like around the eyes here too. Lastly, we'll just add a small amount more depth to the very front of his paws here, and from there this depth map is pretty good to go. Looking really dynamic, which is great for depth maps. So let's just go over to the paint image layer opacity again in Effect Controls and drag it down to 0, and then check out how the depth map works without any of the image behind it. Okay, so that's looking great, and in comparison to our image, it's looking relatively decent in terms of the depth of what we'd expect to see from each independent element. Finally, let's just go up here and swap out the brush tool here for the selection tool, and now we're off to the main dashboard to set up our animation. Right, so we want to create this perfect circular motion here like the final animation shows, which conventionally is going to be quite difficult, so let's use a shortcut to help us out. Okay, so first things first, let's just use the ellipse tool, and how we're going to do that is by clicking and holding on the rectangle tool up here and then swapping it out for the ellipse tool. We'll then bring our mouse to the center, and before doing anything else here, just make sure that you of course don't have any layers selected, so you don't have any of the position scales or any of the other layers selected within Photomotion at the very bottom in your work area. We'll then bring our mouse to the center of the main controller and start creating a circle whilst holding shift, which will make it proportional in size. Before letting go, however, we'll also want it to be centered perfectly in the center of our viewport too. So whilst creating this circle, ensure to hold Control 2, which will center it to the center of the dashboard, and we'll just scale it up so it fits the majority of the viewport here. With this technique of creating an animation, having a large circle here is preferable. If you have a small one, it will over-exaggerate the movements and create this really crazy animation, but it probably won't look so good. Next, we're going to go down to the shape tool and then open up this ellipse one here, and then we're going to right click on this ellipse path here and then select this convert to Bezier path, which will convert the circle shape itself, the outline, into a series of keyframes. We'll then open up this path, then hold Control and hit C to copy that path. We'll then collapse this ellipse and then disable the shape by clicking on the eye icon over here. Next, we'll navigate down to this control move layer here and then paste those keyframes onto the position here. Lastly, let's just bring our playhead to the last keyframe that you'll see here, to the 60 frame point, and then hit N on the keyboard to mark the end of our work path. And that's our animation more or less completely set up. Nothing else that we need to do in regards of that. As you can see, when this animation plays, we have this circular motion here, which is uninterrupted and is actually looking really cool. Alright, well that's more or less the most complicated parts of the tutorial over and done with here, so let's just look at applying the finishing touches. What we'll want to do first, coming straight from setting that animation up, is just swap out the ellipse tool for the selection tool here. Now let's just see about adding in some particles. What we'll want to do is just select the settings button over here, just underneath the blue particles tab, and then go over to Effect Controls and then hit this checkbox under Activate Particles. The next step, of course, is just changing the particle type, as well, petals might seem a little bit OTT here. So let's just choose this number 17, which you could probably interpret as like pollen, which suits the frame rather quite nicely, although they are popping out just a little bit too much. So let's just go over to color correction and change the channel here to alpha, and finally bring down the highlights here to dull out the most brightest areas of these particles. As it stands currently, the 3D scene is just a little bit too populated, so let's get rid of a few of these particle layers. First, we'll click on Further over here and then navigate over to this checkbox under Activate and just uncheck it. That will disable this furthest layer here. We'll then do the same with the distant layer here too, as we want to entirely remove those layers as they're too distracting to be left in. There we go, the animation now looks a little bit more simple and cleaner now, which is a welcome result, of course. Let's just see about previewing with these particles in here. Very nice, and these particles add an extra layer of depth here without being too inherently distracting to the overall dog part of the animation. It's pretty decent, although the middle layer is slightly in the way of our main subject here, so let's just click on the middle button over here and then go over to Effect Controls here, and we can change the X-axis position and move them slightly to the left, and now they're out the way of this dog. Now the next few steps will involve us going into the export composition, as we'll want to basically apply a custom aspect ratio here as well as a lens flare, but for the meantime we'll need to change the export resolution before gaining access to that composition. So first we'll just click on this resolution up here to the right, and then we'll navigate over to Effect Controls and change this drop down here from 1080p to 4K, which will ensure that we export out in a 4K resolution. Now you'll also notice this aspect ratio here in Effect Controls as well. Leave that alone, as those are basically presets for different aspect ratios, so like portrait, vertical, square, and of course cinematic. And the thing is, we can't exactly use that to create our own custom aspect ratio like we'll need to within this example. We can only do so by going into the export composition. So So let's do that now. Now, of course, the first step is, of course, double clicking on this green export button on the main dashboard. When we're inside here, you'll see a series of numbers, which is, well, of course, the Photomotion Perfect Cut system. When we get here, we'll want to first set our working area before really doing anything else. We just want one loop, and in order to have that loop within our export, Photomotion Perfect Cut tells us that we need to render out 60 frames. So let's just do that now. First, what we'll want to do is go over to this frame count indicator and change this number to 60. If you see time code instead, by the way, just ensure to control click on this to change it over to frame count. As you can see, our playhead now has moved to the 60 frames point, and Photomotion Perfect Cut has turned green and tells us that we're good and on the right frame for 0 loops within our animation. Before doing anything else, we'll just want to lock that in place by just hitting N on the keyboard to mark out the end of our workspace, of course. Now, if we were to export as it is now, we'd export by a 16:9 aspect ratio, and therefore these black borders here would be burnt into our animation, which really won't look so good. So don't be confused by these black borders here. It's not alpha channel, it's actually blank space. So we really don't want that within our animation. So let's get to applying our own custom aspect ratio, and we can do so by just holding Control and then hitting K on the keyboard to bring up the composition settings. You can also do this by just going up to the composition tab at the very top and then clicking on the composition settings from there as well. Now, we only want to crop in the edges. We don't want to crop in either the top or bottom here. So let's just unclick this lock aspect ratio checkbox here. The next step is just changing this width, as currently it sits at 3840 for a 4K 16:9 aspect ratio. So let's just dial it down here, and as we do so, you can see the screen in the background slowly shrinks in width. What we want to do is just remove those black bars entirely, so we'll bring this down to around about 3055 pixels, and then of course just hit OK. As you can see, we're no longer seeing those black bars, and that's basically how you create a custom aspect ratio in Photomotion. Next, let's just add in that lens flare. Now, unfortunately, the buttons are covered up by the crop here, but we want to select the box here in the blue to the right, as that's the effects button, and if we double click on that, we'll then see this effects library menu appear. What we'll want to do then is just double click on this lens flare option here, which will show us all the lens flares which we can add in this stage of Photomotion. We'll just scan around the playhead here to preview a couple of these, and we'll probably want to use this one to the top right here, as it's fairly suitable for our animation. So we'll select it here on the main viewport, hold Control and then hit C to copy it, then jump back into the export composition and then paste it there. Now, to fit it in properly, we'll just drag it below this settings layer here first, and then we'll move this fade out marker here to the end of the working area. By the way, you can also hold Shift in order to snap elements that are close to the playhead or on ends of the composition or work area, which is just a pretty neat tool. And the animation is pretty wholesome as it is. Next, with this layer selected, let's just go to Effect Controls and tweak the settings. We'll want this lens flare to appear almost above the tree line, as it's pretty clear that's where the sun within this photo is. We want to replicate that light to make it as immersive as possible. And once we've done that, let's just preview how it is with that lens flare in place. Looking pretty good so far, and that's almost done, although just one final tweak. We'll just bring down the opacity here to around about 70 odd, as currently it's a little bit overbearing. And there we go, that's pretty much complete now. Let's just get to exporting this out now. What we'll do is just go over here to composition and then hit this add to render queue, which will bring our working area into the After Effects render engine. Now, by default, at the very least for PC users, I think, After Effects will attempt to render out an AVI, which is needlessly heavy in this use case. So let's just change that now by going over to here, then hitting this lossless, and that will bring us into this output settings menu. And what we'll want to do is just change this AVI to QuickTime and finally just hit OK. That way we don't end up rendering an obnoxious not just the large file. Finally, just make sure the output name and location is all good, and we'll just hit render, which will render out a .mov of our animation. However, .movs and social media don't go well together, so what if we wanted to upload this to Instagram, for example? Well, we'll have to bring this end render into Adobe Media Encoder, and of course, when we do so, we'll just want to make sure that that format here is set to H.264, MP4 in other words, and of course the output location is to our liking. And there we go, that's this animation now complete, and we have this really wholesome animation on this dog within a field of daisies. Very adorable. Don't forget, if you're interested, we have plenty of other classes on different projections, so if you're interested, feel free to check those out.